Have you ever held a belief so tightly, so confidently, only to watch it crumble in a single unexpected moment? Have you ever dismissed something because the world told you it was inferior, fragile, backwards, and then suddenly realized, perhaps the world was wrong all along? There is a strange kind of shame that comes when arrogance meets truth, and that is exactly where our story begins. Not in the Philippines, not even in Asia, but in a polished glass conference hall in Copenhagen, surrounded by the sharpest minds in European engineering. They were discussing structural innovations for rural communities, flipping through slides of steel, concrete, and composite materials. And then someone brought up an example from the Philippines, a bamboo footbridge in Nueva Ecija that had withstood floods which wiped out steel structures upstream. The moment the photograph appeared on the screen, a faint, almost dismissive laugh rippled through the room. Not cruel, not loud, just that quiet, knowing kind of chuckle people make when they think they already know the truth. Someone whispered under their breath, "Bamboo? Seriously?" Another smirked and said, "Well, it's adorable. I'll give them that." It was the kind of insult that isn't shouted. It's implied. A silent assumption that something built by Filipinos out of bamboo couldn't possibly match European engineering. And what made it sting, even to the outsider listening, was how casually it was accepted. No debate, no defense. As if the entire world had quietly agreed decades ago that bamboo was inferior, that Filipino ingenuity was simple, rustic, almost amusing. What if I told you that sitting in that same room was a Scottish structural engineer, someone so respected that even older professors lowered their voices around him, who once repeated that same dismissive belief? A man who had designed earthquake-resistant frameworks from Istanbul to Osaka. A man who believed physics belonged to steel and concrete, not to the hands of rural Filipino builders. But what if I also told you that just months later he would find himself standing barefoot on a bamboo platform in the middle of a Philippine village, and his entire understanding of engineering would collapse and rebuild in the span of a single afternoon? His name is Douglas Reid, 58 years old, educated in Glasgow, former consultant for 3 of Europe's largest engineering firms, a man of calculations, not emotions. His world was numbers, load capacities, tensile strengths, the unbreakable rules of materials science. And for almost 3 decades, bamboo never made it into his vocabulary except as an example of folk architecture. He didn't mean it as an insult, he meant it as a scientific fact. That was his reality. Until a wildfire-level curiosity began spreading among European engineers about a series of bamboo structures in the Philippines, bridges, homes, even classrooms, built with a method that reportedly outperformed some modern materials during storms and earthquakes. There were rumors that the technique originated from indigenous knowledge, refined by local engineers who understood both tradition and modern load distribution. Some said the joints were handcrafted in ways European modeling software failed to accurately predict. Others insisted it was all folklore. But one detail stood out to Douglas like a bright red warning. Several of these structures had survived extreme conditions where Western designs had failed. He wanted to disprove it. That was his intention. Not out of malice, but out of confidence. "Bamboo cannot outperform steel," he said in one interview. "If it did, we would have known by now." That was the belief he carried as he booked a flight to Manila. And yet, somewhere inside him, a quiet crack had begun forming. The same crack that forms in anyone when they encounter something that challenges everything they've ever assumed. He wasn't ready to call it admiration. Not yet. But he felt something pulling him toward the Philippines, something he couldn't name. A faint tug, like a whisper saying, "Go see for yourself. And as the plane descended toward the archipelago, he had no idea that he was stepping into a story that would break him open, humble him, and ultimately make him say something he never imagined. The world needs to rethink what it thinks it knows about the Filipino mind. Douglas arrived in Manila with the kind of skepticism that sits deep in a person's bones, the kind that doesn't show on their face, but in the way they glance at things, measuring, judging, comparing. He had spent his entire career in countries where rules ruled everything. Japan with its precision, Germany with its discipline, the United States with its endless resources. And yet somehow, despite all those places, he still carried a quiet frustration inside him. A frustration he never admitted. Because for all the strength of their structures, he had seen them fail. Structures he had helped design. Buildings that cracked in Turkey's earthquakes. A footbridge in California that buckled under heat deformation. A roofing system in Croatia that didn't survive a storm it was supposed to withstand. Every failure left a scar on him. Though he never called it that. Engineers are taught to move on, to revise, to calculate again. But deep down, he was tired. Tired of believing that modernity had all the answers. Tired of seeing solutions collapse despite the best technology. And that quiet exhaustion grew heavier after he left Europe. Just before flying to Manila, he had consulted on a rural housing project in India. Their steel frames rusted far sooner than expected, eaten alive by humidity and neglect. He had examined a climate adaptation project in the Mediterranean that looked perfect on paper, but failed to account for the unpredictable force of nature. Every attempt to create something unbreakable seemed to break him a little too. He never spoke about the day he sat alone in his office in Edinburgh, looking at yet another report of structural failure somewhere in the world. This time a school no child should have been inside. He stared at the photographs until his eyes blurred, wondering why engineering felt more like chasing loss than preventing it. In that moment, he felt something he had never admitted to anyone. Doubt. A small but piercing doubt about the very foundations of modern engineering. So, when a fellow researcher mentioned the Philippines, not as a vacation, but as a place where structures made of bamboo were outperforming Western materials, Douglas had scoffed at first, then paused, then leaned in. A week later, he met a Filipino architect in Copenhagen who spoke softly but with conviction about the way bamboo flexes under stress, how it bends, absorbs, and releases energy like a living muscle. How indigenous communities had mastered this understanding for generations. And Douglas felt something inside him shift. Not enough to believe, but enough to wonder. So he came to the Philippines. He expected chaos. He expected disorder. He expected the kind of improvisation that breaks apart under weight. But instead, as he rode through Manila toward his connecting flight, he saw something he didn't expect. Resilience. Not in buildings or structures, in people. In the way strangers helped an elderly woman cross the street. In the way a security guard laughed warmly with a foreign backpacker. In the way Catholic symbols hung gently inside shops. Not forced, not performed, just present, like quiet anchors holding the city in place. His first real encounter with Filipino engineering came not from a building, but from a young woman sitting beside him on a small domestic flight heading north. She introduced herself as Lara, a civil engineering graduate from Batangas. She spoke with a mix of confidence and gentleness that caught him off guard. When he asked about bamboo, she didn't hesitate. "It's not primitive," she said with a small smile. "It's misunderstood." Those words echoed in his mind long after the plane landed. As he traveled deeper into Luzon, passing fields, rivers, and scattered villages, Douglas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation tinged with humility. Because the closer he got to the community whose bamboo structures had become the center of global curiosity, the more he felt his old beliefs pulling against him like two opposing currents. One saying, "This is impossible," the other whispering, "But what if it isn't?" By the time he stepped out of the van and saw the first bamboo framework rising from the ground, so simple, so light, yet impossibly steady, he felt the air around him thicken. Not with humidity, with the weight of a revelation he wasn't ready to face. The first thing Douglas noticed wasn't the bamboo structure itself. It was the silence that surrounded it. A kind of respectful quiet, as if the entire village understood something he didn't yet see. The air smelled faintly of river water and sun-warmed grass. Children played nearby, their laughter rising and falling like gentle waves. And right in the center of that calm stood the bridge he had traveled thousands of miles to inspect. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It stretched across a narrow river like a woven ribbon. Light, elegant, yet strangely commanding. Bamboo poles, polished by hand, joined together with joints that looked too simple to be taken seriously. No screws, no bolts, no industrial equipment, just craft, just precision, just something he couldn't understand yet. A man in his 40s approached him, wearing a faded cap and a smile that carried both humility and pride. "You must be Engineer Douglas," he said. "I'm Mateo. My father taught me how to build structures like this." His voice was steady, as if this moment meant nothing unusual to him. But Douglas could feel the gravity of it. He was standing before a builder whose hands had shaped something that defied European expectations. Mateo guided him closer. The bamboo bridge swayed slightly under Douglas's weight, but not in a way that frightened him. It felt alive, responsive, as if it knew he was there and welcomed his presence. The sensation unsettled him. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered under his breath. Mateo glanced back with a soft laugh. "It moves because it chooses not to break." That line struck him deeper than any technical explanation could. It was poetic, almost philosophical, yet grounded in reality. And for the first time in years, Douglas felt the presence of something lost. Wonder. As they walked, a group of university students arrived, Filipino engineering majors doing fieldwork. One of them, a young man with bright eyes, asked Douglas politely where he was from. When he answered, their faces lit up with excitement. Not because he was European, not because he was well known, but because they were eager to learn. Their sincerity disarmed him. He spent the afternoon observing, asking questions, taking notes, but each answer left him more confused. He expected crude techniques. Instead, he found mathematical precision embedded in tradition. He expected guesswork. Instead, he saw intuition sharpened through generations. He expected fragility. Instead, he found resilience. What surprised him most, though, was the emotional tone of the work. No ego, no competition, no insecurity about impressing outsiders, just community, shared purpose, and a quiet confidence built on lived experience. It felt so opposite from the world he came from, where engineers fought over theories, where pride often overshadowed humility, where the loudest voice was mistaken for the most intelligent. Then came the moment that changed everything. A sudden tremor, small but unmistakable. The ground vibrated beneath their feet as the bamboo bridge reacted, not with rigidity, not with panic, but with a graceful flexibility. Every pole, every joint, every beam moved in harmony. The structure breathed with the earth. And as people around him remained calm, Douglas realized his own heartbeat was racing. He watched the bamboo absorb the movement instead of resisting it. It was the exact opposite of what modern engineering prized, and yet undeniably effective. When the tremor passed, the bridge stood unchanged. Not a crack, not a splinter, not even a shift. Mateo looked at him again, but this time there was no smile, only quiet certainty. "You see, sir, bamboo listens. Steel can't." Those words sank into him like cold water. Not an insult, not a boast, just truth, simple, unpolished, and undeniable. As dusk settled across the river and fireflies began to appear like drifting sparks, Douglas felt something inside him soften. The skepticism he had carried since stepping into the Philippines began to loosen its grip. Not because he suddenly understood bamboo engineering, but because, for the first time in decades, he felt that the world still had mysteries worth uncovering. Walking back toward the village, surrounded by people who welcomed him without question, he felt a stirring he hadn't felt in years, a warmth he couldn't explain, a sense that perhaps he wasn't here to prove anything wrong after all. Perhaps he was here to be proven wrong. In the days that followed, something subtle but undeniable began to shift inside Douglas. It wasn't sudden, like a lightning strike. It was more like a slow sunrise, the kind whose first light is so gentle you almost miss it, until you realize everything around you looks different. He woke each morning to the sound of roosters echoing across the valley and children laughing on their way to school. And every day, he found himself drawn back to the bamboo structures he once dismissed. He watched the villagers work, not hurried, not stressed, just steady, purposeful. There was grace in their movements, as if their hands remembered something the modern world had forgotten. They split bamboo with a quiet discipline. They bent it with heat from small charcoal fires. They tied joints faster than his eyes could track. And what struck him most wasn't the technique, it was the intention behind it. Every knot, every cut, every beam carried an unspoken prayer. In the West, engineering was a science. Here, it was a relationship. One morning, as he observed a group reinforcing a joint, he noticed a grandmother standing nearby, silently tracing the sign of the cross. It was a simple gesture. But in that moment, Douglas understood what he had been missing all along. Faith wasn't the opposite of science. It was the heartbeat behind it, a quiet force that steadied hands, sharpened focus, and reminded the builder that structures weren't just objects. They were protectors of life. He sat with Mateo one afternoon under the shade of a mango tree, the scent of ripe fruit drifting in the breeze. They talked for over an hour, not about materials or formulas, but about their lives. Mateo spoke of how his father had taught him to build, not from textbooks, but by watching the river. How every structure they made was designed to move with nature, not fight against it. "If you resist the earth," Mateo said softly, "you break. If you listen, you endure." That line stayed with Douglas for the rest of the day. Later, he joined a community gathering where the villagers prepared food over open fires. Children carried small plates to him, beaming with pride as if feeding him was an honor. A group of elderly women asked him about Scotland, and he found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in years. The warmth was overwhelming, almost disarming. It was the kind of kindness that didn't ask where you came from or what you believed. It simply welcomed. He had come to study structures. Yet it was the people who were rebuilding him. One evening, as golden light washed over the river, Douglas walked back onto the bamboo bridge alone. He felt the soft sway beneath his feet. Not instability, just responsiveness, like stepping onto the deck of a ship that knew the sea intimately. He placed his hand on one of the beams and felt its warmth from the day's sun. He realized he wasn't touching a mere material. He was touching history, culture, survival, a testament to generations who learned to thrive through typhoons, earthquakes, and loss. And then came the moment that nearly brought tears to his eyes. A young boy ran onto the bridge, chasing after a few floating leaves. The bridge moved with him, playful, gentle, guiding his steps. Douglas watched in awe as the structure carried the child as if it knew exactly how to protect him. That sight, that simple, ordinary sight, pierced straight through every belief he had ever held about engineering. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "I have never seen this anywhere else." It wasn't just admiration, it was awakening. As the first stars began to appear, he felt something inside him settle, like a long-held weight finally being set down. He understood now. The Philippines hadn't just shown him a new kind of engineering. It had restored something he thought he had lost forever. The belief that human hands guided by compassion and faith could create something the world had no blueprint for. In that quiet moment on the bamboo bridge, Douglas realized he wasn't merely studying Filipino engineering. It was transforming him. The morning Douglas prepared to leave the village, the air felt different. Not heavy, not sad, just full, as if everything he had learned, everything he had felt, had gathered quietly around him, waiting to be acknowledged. The villagers had prepared a small send-off, nothing formal, nothing grand, just smiles, warm hands on his shoulder, and a packed lunch wrapped in banana leaves. He wasn't used to goodbyes like that. In Europe, farewells were polite, efficient, practical. But here, every face seemed to hold a blessing. He walked once more toward the bamboo bridge. The river moved gently beneath it, carrying the slow rhythm of the land he had grown to admire. He stopped in the middle and let his hand rest on the railing. The bamboo glowed softly in the early light, and for the first time, he saw himself reflected in its surface, not as an expert, not as an outsider, but as a man humbled by truth. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He remembered the tremor that had shaken the ground days before, the way the bridge had absorbed the force with the quiet strength of something alive. He remembered the grandmother's prayer, the children's laughter, the warmth of the community meal, and the firm conviction in Mateo's voice. All these moments formed a tapestry that wrapped itself around him. He felt gratitude swell in his chest in a way he hadn't felt in many years. What moved him most was the realization that the Philippines hadn't just shown him a different engineering approach. It had shown him a different way of seeing the world. Structures weren't meant to challenge nature, but to understand it. Communities weren't meant to depend on distant experts, but to trust the wisdom of their own land. Strength wasn't found in resistance, but in resilience. And bamboo, the material he had once dismissed, had become a teacher. When Mateo joined him on the bridge, the man's presence was calm, steady, like the bamboo itself. "You'll come back, sir," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was simply a truth spoken with the confidence of someone who knew the rhythm of life. Douglas nodded, unable to speak at first. When he finally found his voice, it was softer than usual. I think I've learned more here in 1 week than I learned in 30 years. Mateo smiled, not in surprise, but in understanding. As Douglas stepped off the bridge, he realized the transformation inside him was no longer subtle. It was complete. The doubts that had once gnawed at him, the failures, the frustrations, the collapse of structures he had designed, no longer felt like burdens. They now felt like stepping stones that had led him exactly where he needed to be. The Philippines hadn't erased his past. It had reframed it, redeemed it, gave it meaning. On his flight back to Manila, he stared out the window as mountains and rivers passed beneath him like quiet guardians. He felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Clarity. a sense that the world was far bigger than the textbooks and theories he had mastered. That wisdom didn't travel only from west to east, but often in the opposite direction, and that sometimes the greatest innovations weren't the loudest or the most complex. Sometimes they were born in places the world overlooked. When he returned to Europe, they asked him what he had discovered. He paused, choosing his words carefully, then simply said, "The Philippines has restored my faith in humanity and in engineering." The room went silent, not from disbelief, but from the weight of sincerity in his voice. For the first time in his career, he wasn't presenting formulas or data. He was presenting truth, living, breathing truth shaped by a culture the world had underestimated. And so his story became more than his own. It became a bridge between worlds, a reminder that in a planet shaken by conflict, disaster, and division, there exists a nation that continues to show, through compassion and resilience, what true strength looks like. The Philippines didn't just build structures out of bamboo. It built hope. It built community. It built something the world desperately needed, a model of how humanity can stand, bend, sway, and still remain unbroken. And to this day, Douglas carries one belief he will never let go. In a world of steel and stone, it is sometimes the humblest material and the humblest people who teach us what real strength is.